Yay.
Hooray, I'm alive. Okay, this is a hangout between myself, Fred McVittie, and Phil Moriarty. Those of us who are watching this hangout will know that this is the culmination of a series of videos that Philip and I have made, which take the form of a debate spread over a few videos, initial opening statements, some rebuttals, and then closing statements, all on the theme or the proposition for the debate was Jordan Peterson speaks the truth, and that was the hook in which we were kind of hanging a series of conversations about truth in science, truth in other kinds of epistemologies, and all things related thereof. And the purpose of this hangout really is just kind of threefold, really. Firstly, just to talk about the debate and how we feel we performed and how our opponents performed, if that's the right word for us, who we are. Things we could have done better, things that we appreciated about one another's ideas. Then we want to move into a section talking about the ideas, but framed really around the comments that were offered by viewers of those videos, which are really insightful and interesting. And we want to use that to launch into some of the ideas that perhaps didn't make it into the debate proper, or did, but were expanded upon by commenters. And then we'll have a few minutes at the end to just talk about the debate format which we set up, what we're kind of interested in with this format, what I was interested in when I launched it, and how we think it's working out, and maybe how it'll work out in the future. So yeah, I hope so. We're aiming for perfection.
That sounded fairly close to me, Fred.
Like truth, you never quite get there. There you go. So yeah, we're aiming to do this for about an hour, so it shouldn't be too draining for any of us. Well, let's wait and see. All right then. Do you want to kick off then, Philip, since I've been doing all the talking so far? Are you still there, Philip? Well, that's a good start. We lost Philip already. Philip, are you there? Well, that's a good start, isn't it? I'm not quite sure what's happened to Philip there. Maybe you can see him, maybe he can see me. I'm seeing a frozen image of Philip at the bottom of my screen right now. But what I said we'd start with is to talk about what we thought went well and what we thought went not so well. And Phil said a couple of times during the debate that I had a harder job than he had, and I'm not convinced that's the case. But what I do think he managed to do really successfully is argue the case for a strong relationship between an epistemological. Hi there, Philip, you're back.
So it froze there for the last minute or so, Fred, I'm afraid.
That's why I've been wobbling on. I've been singing your praises, Philip, so I'm going to continue. One of the things I think I did really well, which I may have had a harder job, I don't know, but I'm going to pretend I did even if I didn't, was that what I thought you did really well was setting up that relationship between an understanding of truth and the epistemology which frames it. With all those caveats in place about how truth functions within the sciences, and you can never quite get to certainty. You managed to link the stuff we were talking about, the key idea about truth, with a really strong epistemology that frames it. I don't think I was able to do that quite. I was too hung up in the early videos to do with this kind of evolutionary framework that Peterson was trying to put on it. I felt I owed him something to do that, but I don't think it was a good strategy for me. So I had a bit of struggle trying to get to a concept of truth via Peterson's epistemology, or when I was intuiting it to be. So I thought you wiped the floor with me with that section of it, to be honest with you, Philip.
So it's I felt for you because you were really playing devil's advocate at times, because I think a major issue, and we'll come back to this because it's brought up in the comments, is Peterson is so incredibly woolly and is so incredibly nebulous, and it's very difficult to get clarity on exactly what he means. And that interview with Harris, or that podcast with Harris that we keep referring to, or I certainly kept referring to, that for me is really nice 2 hours sort of archetypal example of just where there's no substance. There's an awful lot of style and there's an awful lot of sophisticated language, but there isn't a great deal of substance. So that puts you in a very difficult position. And you use the word yourself there very accurately, as you had to intuit, sort of try and use your intuition to try and pull out what the heck Peterson might be saying. And he reminds me so much, and we'll come back to this again, he really reminds me of Deepak Chopra, the same type of woolly, verbose, florid language, and you're trying to sort of hack through it, and you can feel Harris's frustration. And I certainly, every time I listen to Peterson, it's just that sense of, what the hell are you saying? So that was difficult. What really blew me, and I said this in the last, in my last video, the last closing statement, was your final closing statement, where you sort of, to an extent, put Peterson to one side and really said, well, look, this is what the humanities are about. There are different ways to search for truth. And what really struck me is when you said, well, actually, the way your particular framework is, it's in your framework. You're thinking about, this is empirical, this isn't empirical, therefore this is better. And that, honestly, that it's very, very rare in any, to put it mildly, in any type of online interaction I've had before, to get sort of knocked back and have to reconsider and realize, yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing, and make me reconsider and think about just the sciences versus the arts and humanities. And you know how, I have a great deal of consideration. I have a great deal of respect for the arts and humanities, which isn't always the case in STEM. So, yeah.
That's right. I mean, just to pick up on one thing you said there, which I'm not questioning exactly, but the idea of devil's advocate. I wasn't really playing devil's advocate with Peterson. I share your frustrations with a lot of his ambiguity and his contradictory statements. But I was genuinely trying to find things that I could expand upon. I don't think I did a really good job in places, and I kind of wished I'd taken the stance that I used in my closing statement at the beginning, rather than feeling out to defend his evolutionary framework account of truth and morality. I think I would have been stronger if I'd started from placing Peterson within that kind of humanities scholarship, which does work differently to empiricism and kind of STEM scholarship. I think I would have had a stronger suit if I'd done that. But I wasn't trying to argue the devil's case. I've got a lot of problems with what Peterson thinks, and a lot of problems about his politics, and a lot of problems about the way he uses scholarship. It's a very scattergun approach that he uses. He's drawing on evolution, he's drawing on nature, he's drawing, he takes a lot. And Jung here, and never, I have yet to see anything in any depth. I mean, some of his stuff on Nietzsche and the video that you mentioned, where he talks about Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, I thought there's some interesting things in some of that stuff, but it's hard to find him going into anything with any depth that gives it the credibility you want. So I think you have to do quite a lot of the work for him, and that was what I was trying to do, and I don't think I succeeded particularly well. But I wasn't really trying to
But this broader question, and it will crop up because it crops up in the comments, in terms of the arts and humanities, and as you say, scholarship, and I think that's a really good way of pitching it, is in terms of scholarship. And it is intriguing that you did point out that, well, you're just using your own metrics to define what is good and what is not on the basis of what you do as a scientist. So that alone is a very important subject for debate and discussion. I think it might be would be very much worth revisiting that at some point.
I think that'd be great. I mean, as you know yourself, when we were initially talking about this idea of a debate and trying to come up with a topic, one of the alternatives was I can't remember the name of the paper. We were kicking around papers in the humanities and that
the geology paper, the feminist geology paper, or
feminist glaciology. That's right.
Glaciology. That was it.
That's right. Yeah. I have to admit I haven't read that paper in its entirety yet, but I've read a bit of it and I've read some of the critiques of it. But I'm fascinated by those kind of papers or that kind of form of scholarship which kind of borders on science, to the irritation of science and to the irritation of a lot of humanities folk as well. And in the worst cases, doesn't do either humanities or science scholarship any good. But is there a place for it? I'm kind of fascinated by that.
So it's just on that point, because I've got the book sitting behind me. on the desk, and I referred to this at one point, I think, this quantum mind and social science. Yeah. Now, as you know, I think there's an awful lot can be done in terms of looking for those parallels and thinking about the links and what we might import from the arts and humanities into the sciences and what we might import from the sciences into the arts and humanities. For one thing, for example, I'm really keen on is images and imaging and taking, you know, insights from art history and taking insights from sociology of images and communication, etc., and using that to inform how we interpret, and psychology and education, and how we interpret images. But there's a real issue in that there does still seem to be, in some aspects of sociology, on the social sciences, a physics envy, whereby, you know, physics has been so successful in many ways, despite the fact that we still don't know what the vast majority of the universe is made up of. But it's been successful in many ways, to the point where, you know, this is Cambridge University Press, and this is page 3 of this book, which is Quantum Mind and Social Science, which is taking insights from quantum mechanics and using those to try to understand social interactions. Now that is really difficult, because it's not a question of metaphors. This guy actually says, I argue, right, in this book, I explore the possibility that this foundational assumption of social science is a mistake by rereading social science through the quantum. More specifically, I argue that human beings and therefore social life exhibit quantum coherence, in effect that we are walking wave functions. Okay, so not as a metaphor, perhaps. However, he specifically states, I intend this argument not as analogy or metaphor, but as a realist claim about what people really are. That goes against all of quantum mechanics. You know, you can debunk that with one simple observation. When you walk through a door, do you diffract?
Yeah.
That's I think, as you were saying, it pisses off people on the STEM side, but it also pisses off a lot of people on the social sciences side, because they realize it's doing them down.
It does. I mean, I've witnessed those kind of papers myself, because I used to work in theatre for years and years, and kind of teaching it, but also doing kind of research and scholarship in theatre and performance and the arts generally. And I remember going to a conference. It was about presence in performance, the notion of presence, what that means. And one person stood up and gave a talk speculating that presence, in that sense of, you know, an actor who has presence on the stage, is a function of dark energy. It was kind of interesting, and I did ask him, is this an analogy? It's an interesting metaphor, you know, fantastic. He said, no, it's not a metaphor, it's not an analogy, I really mean it. So yeah, that's
see, there's a fine line between that and the emails. We used to get letters in green ink. We now get emails with lots of 90s spinning GIFs and page upon page of the grand unified theory that somebody's developed.
Yeah, it's an interesting area. But I mean, that whole thing of scholarship in the humanities, I mean, putting aside that strange appropriation of science language and science envy, which you rightly point out, I mean, the scholarship in the humanities does work differently, and there hasn't been opportunity in the debate to talk what that might be, and how its validity might be, and whether a concept like truth is even useful in that sense. I don't know. I simply don't know. But it would be great if there was an opportunity in the future to develop that further. That would be really interesting. Definitely.
Do you want to turn to the comments?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so I'm going to try and screen share here. Let's hope it works. Let me put this up first. Let's start with this one, and let's hope the screen share works. Your entire screen share. Can you see that?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Good. So Tom Bailey, I think a point that comes up throughout the exchanges we had, certainly comes up time and time again in the comment section. And as you said, I have to reiterate this as well. The comments are really neat, you know, are beyond neat. They're very perceptive, very intelligent, really cut to the core of a lot of what we're discussing. You know, compared to, for example, you know, this is the this is the XKCD cartoon. This is the usual interpretation of what YouTube comments are like. The internet has always had loud, dumb people, but I've never seen anything quite as bad as the people who comment on YouTube videos. And you can see what's on there. I've seen the space shuttle asshole. It definitely landed on the moon. Do some research. Well, this is what it's usually like. So I know one of your motivations in setting this up was to try and foster a little bit more intelligent debate, and it's at this level it's worked incredibly well. You know, you've probably got well over 100 comments on just this set of initial this first debate, so I think it bodes very well for the future. Anyway, I'll stop waffling on. So this is Tom Bailey. When you say we are trivial, aren't you, and this is directed to me, aren't you also saying the CMBR, cosmic microwave background radiation, and the Mandelbrot set are trivial, or that at least the potential for discovering them is trivial? I think you need to be more discriminating in the use of the term subjective. So some of my comments are over there, but I think I can sum up this idea of triviality with this. So I hope you can see that. This is Carl Sagan's pale blue dot.
Yeah.
Can you see it, Fred?
Yeah.
Okay, that's us. That's us. So this is the Voyager probe. Cameras trained to look back through the rings, Saturn, and you can see that's us. That little pale blue dot. And I'm just going to read out Sagan's word, because this is what I mean by trivial. Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was lived out their lives, etc., etc., etc. We're on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Wipe us out. The universe doesn't care. Now, Peterson hates this because it's nihilism, and he's coming from a very conservative Christian background, and he's arguing for truths that transcend this because he thinks this is too bleak a worldview. And in some ways it is too bleak. It is a very bleak worldview, but this is not something that, you know, I live my life by. The sort of truths, if we must use that term, in terms of, you know, my family and the people I know and love, etc., and how that guides my life, etc. But in terms of the grand universal scheme of things, wipe us out. We're you know, and the universe doesn't care. Indeed, the planet doesn't care. The planet will recover. If we're wiped out, if humanity is wiped out and there's nothing left of us or civilization, the planet will recover. I'm just going to stop sharing now for a second to see if it works. That okay?
Yeah, I don't want to put words into Tom Bailey's mouth, but I think one response to that would be, well, of course the universe doesn't care. The universe isn't capable of caring. The only thing that we can be sure about in that picture, that great picture that Carl Sagan talks about there, the only thing we can be sure that there's any capacity to care are the inhabitants of that pale blue dot. So were that dot to disappear, caring would disappear from the universe.
We don't know that. There could be other planets.
There may be others, in which case, yes, caring exists elsewhere. But as far as we know, and the point of that, of course, is, you know, the power of that image is that is the point in which everything you love and everything that cares exists.
Yes, but again, in terms of the locality of that truth, this is what I mean by trivial. In terms of the grand universal scale, we are trivial, you know. And it's interesting because what religion does is takes that triviality and gives it and puts us center stage, which to me seems to be a complete lack of humility. You know, that the entire universe was created for us, and we don't know that there aren't small blue furry creatures out there orbiting, and, you know, on an exoplanet, perhaps orbiting Alpha Centauri, or perhaps orbiting another star. And this is exactly what I mean by trivial. And even on an earthbound sense, you know, I can drop this pen. I can measure the acceleration due to gravity. Somebody on the other side of the world can do that. They'll see slight variations in terms of where exactly they are on the world. 1,000 other groups can do that. That to me is a powerful, the reproducibility there and the universality, in the sense now a universality in a local Earth sense, is a very powerful way of getting us, as you said, we don't ever get to the absolute truth, but we get to certainly near enough to a truth that holds for everybody, which is beyond a personal and subjective moral truth.
I see what you're saying now. I think that's slightly different to the pale blue dot example you gave. The pale blue dot is we're trivial in the great scheme of things because we're temporary, we're a small mote of dust in an infinite universe. Whereas the universality of the physical laws is a different kind of grandness. Yeah. But again, you know, the decision that one thing is more important than the others ultimately lies with creatures with the capacity to make those kind of value judgments. You know,
but that's exactly it.
Exactly. I mean, I share with you this bit of being both appalled and depressed by the immensity of the universe. You know, I've got a great love of the absurdist poets, for example, or the absurdist playwrights mid-20th century, people like Beckett, who really captured that. It's not exactly nihilism, but that sense of being adrift in a meaningless universe. That I kind of get that, and that in that sense, I see the triviality of that. But at the same time, there is that the only beings we know about can make those value judgments, both to judge the tininess of our own presence and the grandiosity of the universe at large, are, we believe, with current knowledge, to be ourselves. So we're placing ourselves in the picture, not in that kind of religious sense that I think you mentioned, in which we are, you know, deeply aligned to the universe's creation and purpose, but we're still the ones who are making the value judgments about that big things are better than small things, or that universal things are better than temporary contingent things. You know, we're the ones who are making those value judgments.
Yes, agreed. But I think the common theme throughout the discussion we had is in terms of those value judgments. I've made the argument again, sort of, we can do those measurements, etc. There's an empiricism there, and there's a testability. I guess that's it. And, you know, this is the scientist speaking as ever. There's a testability. How do we do it? How do we make those value judgments, you know, in terms of different religions, different faiths, if we don't have empiricism and we don't have testability? What are our ground rules for making those value judgments?
I don't know for sure. I mean, that's not directly to do with the triviality thing, though, is it? I mean, that's the...
I think it is, Fred. I do think it is related to the triviality thing, because if we, the more universal something is, the more we can agree on it, the more various different people, not just on the earth, but across the universe, you know, if they do exist, and we've got no reason to rule them out, but then we've also got no reason, a la Russell, to, you know, to rule out the possibility of a flying teapot around a planet as well. I appreciate that, but the issue is, in terms of the value judgments within a particular culture, within a particular society, it is incredibly parochial to say that this faith or this faith or this faith, are they all equally valid? And
no, I don't think we need to go to faith. I think we can go to quite specific things here. I mean, one of the examples that really great examples you brought up was recent legislation about same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
Now, there's an argument to be made for that, which I don't know how you'd get an empirical argument constructed around that, but maybe there are empirical arguments to be made. But nevertheless, there are values at work there, and some values are, I believe, more correct than others to apply to that discussion. I also think that discussion is more important than a better image of the cosmic microwave background radiation. You might disagree with that, but I think it's a more important truth to find, if I can put it in those terms, which don't fit very well, but nevertheless, I think it's more important to solve that problem than to solve the problems of the cosmic microwave background radiation. You may disagree, but it's in that sense that sometimes very, very local and very specific truths or quests for moral value, for me, trump universal empirical truths.
Okay, so that's an interesting one. In terms of the value I place on getting a better image, as you say, which is a great example of the cosmic microwave background compared to same-sex marriage and sort of the whole moral universe, if we put that. In terms of weighing those up and which is more important for humanity, yeah, I'd probably side with you there. But in terms of which is a universal, non-trivial, non-parochial fact or truth, if we want to put it that way, the microwave background is out there. It pervades the universe. We are, as it said, a motor speck within that universe. The problem with the same, and you said it yourself, you feel that, you know, there's a certain truth there, but we both know that across the pond and even here, there are many that adopt a very, very different view. And in what sense then, coming back to the theme of the argument, in what sense then does Peterson's moral truth, which by definition will be different for different cultures and different societies and will evolve in time and must evolve in time, how does that trump those, I would say, how is that a bigger truth than the empirical truth of the universe that we find ourselves in?
To be honest with you, I can't find a way that Peterson could answer that, because when the evolutionary stuff and the post-Nietzschean pragmatic kind of versions of truth that he seems to be aiming towards, I can't see how he could square that circle, to be honest. I think he would argue that there is a kind of universality in that kind of local sense that you mentioned. I think he would argue that, in that we're all tottering bipeds, you know, trying to reproduce and do that kind of thing. I think he would probably draw on something like that. But just in terms of triviality, I think we've got quite a simple distinction between what we mean by trivial, haven't we, really? One, and it's to do with impact, that university word, impact, that our research has to have real world impact, and the value of a piece of research is increasingly judged by the impact it has, you know, that kind of thing.
Oh yes, very well.
i.e. real world impact, and blue skies research, which doesn't have any application or impact. Of course, it's still valuable, but there's a question mark about that.
So that's, okay, that's a really nice way of framing it.
Okay, so I don't know if that's clear. If anybody's watching this, who isn't in any university, who isn't to do with knowing about universities. Universities are funded partly upon the research that they carry out, and that funding that comes into research in universities is doled out to scholars who are practicing various kinds of research. And increasingly, one of the metrics for judging research, the quality of research in universities, is its impact, which means how is it being picked up by industry, by the wider culture? How are people finding out about it? How is it being disseminated? You know, are people talking about it on YouTube? Is it appearing in BuzzFeed? Are people writing apps based on your research? All that kind of stuff, really. And that's quite different to, you know, doing a really important piece of research which only 12 people in the universe can understand because it's so rarefied. However beautiful, elegant, and ultimately universally explanatory it is. So I think there's an analogy there in terms of an understanding, an approach to triviality.
Okay, there's a hugely important oh man, it's hugely important parallel there. I've banged on about impact quite a lot over the years. The type of work we do is fairly fundamental, although it's nanoscience, it's condensed matter physics, which in principle could have an application. It's fairly fundamental, and I would actually argue, it's interesting on this point, fundamental physics, or physics in general, is lumped in with engineering and is lumped in with STEM, and you've got STEM versus arts and humanities. I would say in terms of ethos, that actually fundamental physics, which is about this greater search for truth, however we might define it, or greater search for understanding of our universe, is actually better aligned with the arts and humanities than it is with engineering. Because with engineering, it is that short-term win. It's that short-term market-driven, can we get this widget out there? How do we apply the physics that we've used and the mechanics that we've used with the electronic engineering or whatever? How do we apply those principles? So I have a great deal. So it's a very useful way to frame this, because let's take I don't know. Let's take the laser. There's a really great example. So the laser was developed by a guy called Townes, and his head of department told him time and time again, stop wasting time working on this toy. It's a solution looking for a problem. Forget about it. Move on to something more important and something more useful. And Townes stuck with it, and the laser underpins so much of our society. Now, that's a very utilitarian argument. I mean, you can wrap yourself up in knots in terms of applied and various levels of application. But the important thing there is, how do we define importance? That was a very fundamental piece of research that absolutely revolutionized our world, our technology. Similarly, complex numbers, square root of -1, who would ever want that? And yet it's embedded within quantum cryptography. It's embedded within quantum mechanics, which again underpins so much of our universe. So I think coming back to the idea of what is valuable, what is worthwhile, I think it's dangerous to say that only that which has recognizable near-term application is worthwhile. That's one thing, but I would also go further than that. I would say that even if something has no application ever, is just a piece of work that as you say, explains the universe. The important thing with science, and the important thing with our body of knowledge, and this is something we ask of PhD students, is that you contribute to that body of knowledge, and it's an incremental process. The common argument is standing on the shoulders of giants, or the common quote that's used. I don't like using that because actually it takes it entirely out of context. Newton said that. He said it off Hooke, and it was meant as a slur because Hooke was quite small. And what Newton meant was, if I have seen further than others, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants, not on your shoulders. So, but you get the idea. It's different levels. So
I do, yeah. I mean,
it's an interesting.
I think what Tom Bailey is suggesting there is we're applying different understandings to triviality. One is to do with value, human value, improving people's lives, contributing to flourishing, preventing suffering, those kind of things, as opposed to a much more esoteric version of value, which is to do with knowledge, to do with all the abstractions you talk about almost, and possibly, admitting there might possibly be a utility thing, but we don't really need to worry about utility right now. That knowledge itself is a value within which I would agree with, of course, and I would say that's shared with the humanities and the arts. So in a sense, I'm not sure we're able to. I don't know where the chips would fall on that. Whether I just know that if I was being, I know that if I was the subject of some form of oppression that was capable of being reversed by the asserting of some kind of moral truth, I would say that was the most important truth in the universe. And okay. I would,
yeah, no, I agree. But on the other hand, if you're suffering from some horrible disease, and we could raise the smallpox question again, would you really want to wipe out, or would you really place scientific knowledge on a lesser footing that that could cure you? And Peterson talks regularly about pain and the important truth value of pain, etc.
Yeah.
To me, I don't think you can disconnect. I think it's like practically every question we have it's not a question of it's at this end or it's this end. It's a spectrum and it's a gradation. And I think that the truth value, I think the utility and the fundamental understanding tend to often, not always, but tend to often go hand in hand.
I would agree, yeah. And to be honest, I don't think trivially true is the way. In the way that we're talking about it now was really the way that Peterson was talking about it. I think he was much more talking about it in that kind of nested way, which I still haven't fully wrapped my head around, to be honest.
Will we move on to the next question?
Yeah, let's do it.
Or the next comment? Yeah, let's go share that again. Back here, that lovely image again. Okay. Oh, so this actually, that's interesting. So that's the point we've just been discussing, actually. Would you rather the world lost all its knowledge of physics, or that the first world abandoned its commitment to civil rights for minorities? So thanks for that, Fergus. But I guess we've dealt with that, Fred. Would you agree?
I would agree. Yeah, it's a great comment. Well made. Thank you, Fergus.
Absolutely. Thanks, Fergus. Oh, okay. This one's directed to me. I'm not inclined to credit your claim that humans are, in your opinion, trivial. I don't mean that I disagree that humans are trivial. It's that I don't believe that you yourself believe it. Again, I guess we've covered that. But Fergus, you probably heard as I struggled to put sentences together that, of course, I'm not suggesting that on personal relationships in terms of moral values, if we want to call them moral truths, etc., that humans are trivial. In that sense, it's very much in the Carl Sagan small blue dot sense that I was talking about triviality. But I guess let's move on past that. Okay. This is again okay. So this is coming back. This is slightly moving on now in terms of myths. You see internet. I'll read this whole thing out. You talk so eloquently about the deeper universal truths. He's directing that at me, surprisingly. You are appreciating them aesthetically. I can appreciate them aesthetically, but that's not the point. That's not the real point of the as a physicist would say, zero order point. So what's your justification for the science realism myth? Empiricism and testability. That's my justification. It's testable. Somebody makes a claim and that claim can be testable. Is it that it works, that it is profound and useful? It's also that, yes. It seems certainly like that is your motivation for being so protective of that myth. But the problem is, if you take that as a myth, give me a mechanism, a heuristic, which is better than that, which is better than having something which is empirically testable. You see intonations of meaning in it, to use Peterson language. Well, there's a wonderful example of, the very cloudy, woolly language that Peterson uses all the time. What does he mean by that? He would agree, I think, and loves the science for many of the same reasons, apart from the fact that in the discussion with Harris, he continually suggests that the factual legitimacy of scientific claims is secondary to the moral truth value. So while he might pay lip service to the importance of science, I think it's very much lip service, that he sees it as secondary to. I don't know what your take on that is, Fred.
There's some stuff which is specifically aimed at yourself, and he's using the term science myth, which I put in there, partly as a provocation to yourself, as I'm sure you can, but also just to kind of borrow some of these of Peterson's framing, because there is a way, I think, of looking at the debate, the way of looking at the assumptions that the successful assumptions that you've rightly reiterated, to do with the assumption that an objective world exists, the assumption that we can make close approximations towards it, the assumption that progress in science is constituted in the ever greater approach towards some kind of accurate portrayal of that objective universe. Those kinds of statements, which are justified by their results, but philosophically not justified. So they do function as a kind of myth, and moreover, it works in the way that myths do to structure large other parts of our lives, which is what I was kind of. I don't want to relitigate my entire video, but that's what I was getting at with myth, and I think that's what that commentary is drawing on there. But like all myths, it requires us to invest in them. We believe in them, and in every sense of the word belief, both assume to be true, but also make a commitment to them. That's kind of what belief means, isn't it? We commit to them and allow them to structure our lives. And I think that there's a sense in which science is doing that beyond its pure functionality. It's also hegemonic in that sense that it's structuring our perceptions, our understanding of what truth is, our understanding of what the appropriate circumstances in which we should believe something. That's what myths do, and I think that's what science is doing.
I think that's all fair, but again, doesn't address the fundamental point of, okay, let's just say that science is a myth in that sense. why should I choose any other myth given the power of science and the fact that it's testable and the fact that it works? It's like, as I say over in that sort of my comments in that little box on the right hand side. So why shouldn't I just take the Great Green Arkle Seizure myth?
Because
why shouldn't I select that above the inflation, for example?
I don't think you should. I think that you've picked the right one. It's very successful, and the Green Arkle Seizure is beautiful, I'm sure, but I suspect its explanatory power is very little. No, I don't think there's any reason not to. I mean, myths work. Myths do a job, and they work very successfully. And the science story is very, very successful. So why would anybody want to use a different story? But of course, it only really applies to great big things like the universe and matter and the forces. It doesn't.
Well,
I think it would be hard to talk about. I mean, we started talking about moral truths at the beginning of this, and Sam Harris is a moral realist. Jordan Peterson may be a moral realist. I'm not quite sure, but many people have got a problem with moral realism. You can't boil morality, ethics, politics, most of social engagements, the arts, aesthetics, most of that stuff. You can't boil it down to a set of empirical claims. So do you just say, well, we must just remain silent about that, or we can't have any truth claims about that, or we can't do scholarship about it, or we can't talk about it in an informed, critical way, or we can't build upon. There's no knowledge in those fields. It's just kind of whacking off. As I kind of intimated in one of the later videos, most of our lives aren't spent doing empirical work. Yes, as you rightly pointed out, we do make sort of quasi-empirical judgments about, whether we're going to fall off a cliff or not. But but most of the values and the meanings of our lives aren't empirically based at all, are they? They're operating in different kind of frameworks. So I kind of lost my thread here. Most of our lives are not directly informed by the structure of scientific, objective, empirical research, and yet we live them. And occasionally we act as if they should be, as if they kind of are. And you'll find many debates on YouTube about people bringing science into places where there's no business being, well, I'll say no more on that, but you can kind of guess where I'm going with that, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't think this is, I was about to say devil's advocate, again, by using the term. Let me put it like this, and let's dial the nihilism up to 11 and beyond. Isn't everything reducible to our biochemistry?
No, I don't think so. Well, it depends what you mean by reduce. Is our biochemistry the platform on which everything else operates? Sure, yeah, it's the substrate in which everything is going on. But I don't think that necessarily, in the same way that the computer that I'm looking at now is ultimately reduced to pieces of silicon. But that doesn't stop the fact that there's a lot more going on than just silicon, right?
I agreed, but ultimately, as you say, the substrate is, in that case, the silicon, and how the charge is manipulated in the silicon. And ultimately, in our case, it's our biochemistry, and how ultimately, in many ways, charge is manipulated by our biochemistry.
Sure.
So yeah, I know that's nihilism up to 11, and I'm not suggesting that all of humanity. Oh, yeah, exactly. All of humanity should be reducible to the idea that, we're just automatons driven by our biochemistry. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. Talking about truths, then in some sense, it is reducible to, that biochemistry.
Well, you can say true statements about biochemistry, and you can say, well, one of the things that Jordan Peterson talks about is, I think it's in an interview we did with Joe Rogan. He mentions it almost in passing, but he's saying we had the idea of truth long before we had the idea of empiricism. Truth's been around for donkey's years. Truth was argued in classical Greece. So and presumably even before it was talked about, there was something going on in our ancestors' brains and lives which corresponded to something like truth. So truth has been around a lot longer than the modern methods by which we can approximate something close to it. You know, the empirical methods you're talking about. So,
but that doesn't mean that we had defined truth. That doesn't mean that we'd actually approached that truth. You know, alchemy was accepted for quite some time. Very many different myths were accepted for quite some time. The sort of the age or the extent or the centuries over which something has been accepted, good measure of the truth value of that particular myth, if we want to put it like that, or that particular worldview.
Well, I think we should make the distinction again between the word truth in relation to empirical facts and kind of wider understanding. Remember, truth in relation to empirical facts is a recent idea.
Yeah, fair. No, I'll accept, absolutely. I'll accept that. Yes, definitely.
So, but the idea of truth prior to that was a much more. Firstly, there was the idea that truth could be absolute was, I suspect, fairly commonplace then, in the same way that it is in some religious circles these days.
And also in math, you could make claims in terms of mathematics, in terms of there is deductive proof, deductive truth in some systems of mathematics. Incompleteness theorem, I guess we don't want to go at this time of night. We don't want to go down that particular pathway.
I was so tempted to bring this up. Because I know there was 1 or 2 comments from someone. Maybe you've got them screenshot. I don't know about talking about logic.
Yeah,
and maybe mathematics, which I thought were fascinating. I was so tempted to bring it up because you and I had a conversation some time ago about that great number file video, in which you had to put all of the positive integers, 1 plus 2,
yeah,
infinity, and what the answer to that is. And there's several proofs, isn't there? Euler did a proof and several of you.
Yeah, you need to be extremely careful in that. That's the subject of some debate within the school, let's put it that way, and has been the subject of some debate because it does depend exactly on how you define the equal sign.
It does. The point, if anybody hasn't seen the number file video, adding up all the positive integers according to several methods and some proofs gives the result -1/12. I think I'm right in saying. But as you rightly point out, it depends on what that means.
Yeah.
So even at the level of something as deductive as mathematics, there's an interpretation is at work there, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think
the set of principles in which you're working, you have to define
precisely. Yeah, and you could make that argument even in terms of, we talk about deductive proof, but that's deductive proof by deduction on the basis of a set of axioms you define.
Exactly.
So in what sense actually is it ultimate universal truth then?
Exactly. Yeah.
Good. Okay, let's move on because I think we're past an hour already, Fred.
We're just about 50 minutes so far, so we've got about.
Okay. Let's say, let's get rid of fences. Bye fences.
Let's install that.
Fences is great. Not that I'm getting commission.
I have no idea, but I'm assured they make good neighbours.
Okay, this is an interesting one. I think this is probably coincidentally exactly what you're talking about. So Kevin Solway, who's left a number of very in sharp contrast, philosophical and purely logical truths are not tentative but are immediately absolute. Now, I would quibble with that. There is no measurement, but there is direct perception. I don't understand what's meant by direct perception, which enables us to be absolutely certain of our findings. I can't agree. The mathematics, this is particularly in this case, the mathematics of the Mandelbrot set never varies, so it can be known with absolute certainty, unlike empirical truths. Now, the Mandelbrot set is a really interesting and important example here, and I brought it up advisedly. I included it. I didn't have time to go through the detailed reasons why I included it, and I'm not going to have time here. But the important thing with the Mandelbrot set is you can write down it's mind-blowing if you think about it. The Mandelbrot set you can code in a few lines of code, 5 or 6 lines of code, and you can set that up and you can zoom in and you can zoom in, you can zoom in and you can zoom in with infinite resolution effectively. The problem is you're working on the only way to do that, you could do it with pen and paper, But even then, there's a finite resolution in the dots you can put on any piece of paper, the pixels you can make. So you are always working at some level of approximation to that set when you see those beautiful images. It's not known with absolute certainty. You're exploring, and you can get to a zoom level, which is equivalent to taking the universe and zooming down to a single atom, in terms of the Mandelbrot set. But you can still, the thing about the Mandelbrot set is you can keep zooming and zooming and zooming in. So it cannot be known with absolute certainty. Yet the algorithm that creates it can be written, well, in a few lines of code, but actually can be written down in one line of mathematics. So that's an intriguing distinction between, I guess, the map and the territory.
Yeah.
So the territory you can never fully know. You can come up with a map that produces that territory, I guess, in the context of the Mandelbrot set. But there's a very subtle and important difference between the map and the territory. And I think a lot of people, a lot of theoretical physicists in particular, forget that. They get blown away by the elegance of the mathematics. And there are certain areas of theoretical physics I could go into, but I'll not name them here. Forgotten that the mathematics is just a map of what's out there. It's again not absolute truth in the sense that this is the absolute representation of reality.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that didn't come up in our conversation, in our debate, mainly because Peterson and Harris and so on didn't really mention it, was just different understandings of what truth meant in terms of coherence or correspondence. And from what little I know of mathematics, and logic, which somebody mentioned quite a bit, it tends to rely on a coherence version of truth. Coherence models of truth are ones in which statements reinforce one another, and each statement is coherent with every other statement in a universe of discourse. Whereas correspondence ones are the ones that figure within empiricism. A statement is true if it corresponds to a fact out there in the real world.
Yeah.
So,
but interestingly, in science,
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Fred, to interrupt me, because that I would say that distinction is blurred, or even in many cases non-existent when it comes to physics. In particular, where you have a fantastic example is the discovery of the positron. So that was Dirac. And he followed his mathematics through, his purely theoretical mathematics through, to say, well, okay, if I take one solution, I get the electron. If I take this other solution, I get antimatter. And then we found that. We empirically searched for that. I say we, I mean the physics community. And we found that. Now, there's a very good example of exactly the correspondence and the coherence versions of truth brought together into one. And that's when physicists get really excited. That's when physicists start thinking, actually, we're on to something here, is when the mathematics leads you in a particular direction and you empirically show that there is a correspondence between your mathematics and what's out there, for want of a better word.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. I suppose the distinction I'm trying to draw is something like logic, which was held up, and mathematics, which was held up in some of the comments, quite interestingly and rightly in many ways, as a superior form of truth, because it can at least suggest absolutes. Although I fully accept what you say about the Mandelbrot set and quantum theory and so on. But one of the reasons why is because it relies much more strongly on coherence rather than on correspondence.
Yeah, and we're drawn to that. I think the whole scientific framework, as we're taught, what we're taught in terms of scientific method, and of course there is no universal scientific method either, but that's a whole other discussion. But we look for that coherence, and we try to, in fact, I think even outside of science, don't we look for coherence in almost everything we do? We look for self-consistency.
Yeah, that's the cognitive dissonance thing you want to avoid, isn't it, if you're not coherent? Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, let's move on to I'm conscious of time. Let's move on to the next one. Yeah, okay. So I think this is from Jonathan, a very good point, and I think the problem is, as we go through this, given the time's running out, we're not going to be able to do justice to all of these points. But this is, I think, a reiteration of what we've been talking about in terms of scientific empirical facts and different epistemologies, which I think we've worn that particular furrow. ploughed that particular furrow. It's too late. I'm mixing metaphors all over the place.
And he does draw attention to that whole map territory distinction, which
he does.
It comes up quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan. Next one. Okay, this one I do want to spend just a couple of minutes on, if it's okay, a minute or so on, Fred, if it's okay with you, because there's this so many quotes attributed to Einstein are entirely apocryphal. The poor man's been attributed to saying just about everything on every topic. And when you search back and look back and try and look at the historical accuracy of these claims, it doesn't hold out. One of those is if you can't teach it to something along the lines of, if you can't teach it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it. I really don't agree. And I'm afraid, Kevin, I agree with many of your other points, but this I can't agree with. Even the most profound and difficult truth can be expressed simply and plainly in a few words. No, quantum mechanics, regardless of where we place those levels of distinction or truth or whatever, quantum mechanics is our best theory in terms of describing the universe and describing the makeup of matter. It performs incredibly well in terms of the metrics we've discussed before. It's not something that can be expressed simply and plainly in few words. Even if we go, back a few steps in terms of complexity, why is the sky blue? Now, you can have a range of different answers to that. And as I say, they're ever decreasing circles of uncertainty is probably the best way to think about it when you're teaching physics. But, at the core, the reason the sky is blue is not something that can be expressed simply and plainly in terms of if we really want to get that message across. Similarly, why is glass transparent? You can explain, as we've done with that 60 Symbols channel, which is one of Brady Haran's many channels which is focused on science education and mathematics education. Now, you can make a 5-minute video, as we did, on why is glass transparent. We don't even begin to scratch even the smallest, amount of the surface of that particular question. You can give an answer that is expressed simply and plainly, but it's not a profound and difficult truth.
Yeah, I would agree with you completely. Perhaps you can confirm or deny another Einstein quote then, which is that you should try to things should be explained as simply as possible, but no simpler.
I think that is actually accurate in that, and I'm very willing in the comments section, if somebody wants to tell me I'm completely wrong, that's absolutely fine. But to the best of my knowledge, I think that attribution is accurate. I do think he said that. I can't remember in what context, but and at what point in history, but I think I did go chasing back to try and find the source, and I think it is legitimate in that case.
Yeah,
but I could be wrong.
There may be some distinction or I wouldn't say dispute, but there might be some difference in what we think is complex. I mean, I know there are people out there who think that quantum theory is overcomplicated nonsense and it could be more simply expressed, because I've met them. But that's nonsense.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I know that there are also people who say that, and you might be one of these, Philip, you can tell me if you are, who say that some of the more poetic waxings of some of the humanities writings, it's really just obfuscation. It could be written simpler. And I would say that you're probably right in some cases, but in other cases, it's an attempt to write as simply as you can and no simpler, because the subject you're writing about isn't as simple as it might appear.
Yes, no, I agree, Fred. Yeah, and I certainly point to Karen Barrett, and I think you have some sympathy for what Barrett's trying to do. Perhaps
I don't know enough to be able to comment on that, but
okay,
I recognize some of the styles. Yeah,
but that type of thing. So with quantum, is quantum, the last word? Is quantum theory the last word? No, there are many aspects of it that we still don't understand. In particular, something called entanglement, the sort of classical quantum crossover, all of that stuff we really don't understand. Is it the last word? No. Is there possibly a simpler theory where we make sense of some of those mathematical, some of the mathematical framework, perhaps? But is it elegant? Yes, it's really elegant. Is it difficult and complex? Yes, it's difficult and complex. But it's interesting. You can have something which is elegant but is also complex. In both senses of the word, complex in terms of complicated and also complex in terms of mathematically complex numbers. So I think we need to, as exactly as you said with that Einstein quote, we do need to try to aim for that clarity. For me, the difficulty with the social sciences, some aspects of the social sciences, is there does seem to be this, it's almost like a rite of passage that you have to lapse into this willfully impenetrable style and of writing. And the difference I see between that and quantum physics is that in quantum physics, we're sort of forced into that mathematics. Right at the core of quantum physics is something called a wave function. We cannot observe that experimentally. It's a mathematical object that we can do some mathematical operations on it, and we can connect it to experimental results that way. But fundamentally, it's not what we call an experimental observable. Now, that embeds a type of complexity or a level of complexity in your theory, which is just nascent, and it doesn't matter what you do to try to work around it. It's there. There's a massive difference. If we could find a simpler theory, we would jump on it and we would jump for joy. That's different from what happens, as I see it, sometimes in the humanities, particularly some aspects of social science, where it's not a question of reaching and trying to aim for the clearest possible language. It does seem to be very much a question of style over substance. And of course, there has to be style in writing, but the best writing is not the most impenetrable and the most dense, I would say.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm certainly not putting a value on density for its own sake. But one of my favourite novels, just to switch in quite a bit, is Finnegan's Wake. I don't know if you know Finnegan's Wake.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Right. It's one of the most impenetrable novels. I bloody love it. You have to read it aloud. You have to read it 20 or 30 times. You have to see the patterns of it, because there are kind of recurring patterns of sets of initials for the characters' names, these kinds of things. There's endless references to other texts that you kind of have to intuit as there, and then maybe do a bit of research on. You know, the very first word of it is a made-up word, river run. The word river and the word run together. The last line of the last page joins up to the first line, the first bit. It's an insanely complex thing, but it's off-putting to say the least. But it is obscure and impenetrable, but it's absolutely gorgeous. And it kind of needs to be as complex as it is in order to work. On a narrative level, it's a story about, some people doing some stuff. So you could simplify it to the story about people doing some stuff, but you would lose everything that makes Finnegan's Wake what it is. So I do think there's some analogies there between. I'm not going to say Finnegan's Wake is like quantum theory. Okay, I promise there's not a paper coming out like that. But I think there's to the extent that there is something like knowledge, truth, poetic wisdom, insight, all those kind of valuable views on the way that life is lived and the finality of it and all those kind of things in Finnegan's Wake. To the extent that those things exist, it needs to be as complex and maybe even as opaque as it is in order to be able to express that, I think. And I think the same is true, although I admit it's not to the standard of Finnegan's Wake, with some humanities writing. There's a lot of crap out there for sure, but a quest for clarity of its own sake, for its own sake, I don't think is necessary. And a recognition of the complexity of the idea. I mean, let me give you an example.
I'm just going to turn this off because I'm really enjoying listening to you, Fred. Let me turn this off for the time being, so we'll go back to where am I? You still there?
I'm still here. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Go on ahead.
I mean, certainly in some humanities writings, and I wish I'd pre-prepared some examples for this, but certainly some of the humanities writings, some of the most simple and obvious concepts are the ones that's up for debate. So, for example, if you're talking about yourself, or if you want to use the first person pronoun, the word I in it, it may be that your studies of what an agent is, what a person is, how a subject is formed, are intimately part of the research that you're carrying out, or the scholarship that you're engaged in, or the kind of writing you're doing. So just using the word I, a single one-letter word, is already riven with all kinds of information and ideas and potential problems. So if a word like I requires an awful lot of thought before you can use it, and a careful positioning of it in relation to other words, and maybe caveats which break it up and do funny things with it. You know, quite often you'll see in a lot of humanities writing that annoying use of words which have got parentheses included within them in odd places.
But I do that a lot as well.
Well, good on you. You know, I mean, yes, technically can be abused, but one of the things that kind of strategy is attempting to do is to open out the very language that you're using to the complexity which the scholarship that you're bringing is telling you is there. So you can't simplify it down to, well, I'll just use the word I, then everybody knows what I is. If you're working with a set of ideas about I which don't necessarily correspond to common sense and aren't simple and can't be reduced to the plain language, then you might need to do all kinds of funny things with language to try to express yourself. And some of them do end up looking like Finnegan's Wake, and maybe that's as simple as you can get it.
No, that's great. That really again has given me huge insight that I didn't have before. The Finnegan's Wake example is great. Obviously, with this accent, I think the Finnegan's Wake example is great. You know, that's I can see where you're coming from. I can see where you're coming from, and that clarity isn't necessarily the virtue I might always think it is. Yeah.
But it's your game for sure. You see, I think empiricism and clarity, of course, it's a non-starter that you would try that, but that isn't necessarily the case for other things. And just one last thing on language. One of the things that you've talked about in the past, which I really like, is to do with an approach to interpretations of quantum theory. And you mentioned a minute ago that there were 20 or something was the number I think you put up next to it.
Yeah, it varies on almost a weekly basis.
Yeah, and the advice given to students, I believe you said, is to shut up and calculate. You know, don't get bogged down in the interpretation, because the interpretations are always formed by usually in the form of spoken language and in the form of, you know, two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional universes that our bodies can relate to and our, you know, monkey brains can find acceptable. So you have to kind of leave that stuff behind, maybe even leave language behind, certainly leave conventional language behind, in order to be able to do justice to the ideas that you're dealing with.
That's exactly it. Sorry, go on.
But the same is true of the humanities, except we don't have any mathematics. So you have to kind of do it with the language as well. So it's a bit more complicated. Unless you're in the arts in which you use images and stuff.
Yeah. And images is something, yeah, we could certainly discuss it at length, and the importance of images. But yeah, there's the Pratchett quote I'm desperately trying to remember, something about quantum mechanics isn't designed in terms of our language and intuition, which was evolved in terms of telling the other monkeys where the ripe fruit was, something along those lines.
Yeah.
Okay, let me go back to screen share. My mouse has stopped working. So I guess we need it. We'll where are we now? We're already 20 past 11. You've got work in the morning. I've got skating lessons, not from me, but early in the morning as well. So let me let me share this. Right. Okay, so that's again a question of universality and faith. I think we've covered that ground.
We have. Thanks, Felix, for mentioning that. That was one of the reasons I came to this, because of that comment. That was great.
Brilliant. Talks about pain. I guess the concept of pain. I really find Peterson and Stroh. This is an important point. So thanks, Cassandra Sintro meets Radu Molasar, if I've pronounced that correctly. I agree entirely. Peterson does spend an awful lot of time talking about pain. I've tried, Zarquan, I've tried to get inside his head and try to understand what he's talking about there, but it just makes so little sense to me. For example, one of his things is pain is the only thing that people will never deny. But you know, if I see a greater value in denying that pain, even to myself, almost even at a psychological level, I will do so. If me denying my pain I don't know, say I'm suffering from some disease or other, and I don't want my family, I don't want my loved ones to find out about that. Of course, denial of pain serves a greater truth. And you could even argue about placebos, and in terms of how the psychology of I really do think that with Peterson, so much of it is like reading Chopra. And for those, just to hammer this home, you mentioned Joe Rogan before. I think this is the same episode you were talking about, Fred. But this is pure Chopra. These are 4 quotes, just 4 from that Rogan episode. It's an harmonious balance in the multiple layers of being. Religious writings are guidelines to that mode of being, the hyper-true or meta-true. Your brain is attuned to telling you this. When you have an intimation of meaning, then you know you're there. The music is modeling the man of being. That is pure Chopra. It's florid language that really, and his arguments about pain are exactly the same. There's this wonderful site called The Wisdom. You might be able to say the wisdom of Chopra.com. So for those of you who don't know, and I think there are a few who don't know, because Chopra, for one thing, is something like 3.5 million followers on Twitter, and an awful lot of, how can I put it, leverage, and an awful lot of people hang on his every word. But there's this bullshit generator which actually produces quotes from Chopra. There's just one. Fundamental reality is at the heart of spontaneous brains. It's basically a random number generator hooked up into a database of Chopra sayings or Chopra quotes. You can put it together. I think very easy to generate one of those for Peterson as well, because it really is a question of or a discussion of complexity and clarity in language notwithstanding, Fred. I think there is the reason it's so difficult to understand what Peterson is saying is that often Peterson doesn't know what he's saying himself.
You may well be right. I mean, I don't want to defend either Peterson or Deepak Chopra, even though I did share a conference with Deepak Chopra many years ago.
Did you?
I did. I used to do conferences on consciousness.
Okay.
That was one of my areas of research, consciousness within a kind of performance context. But the field at that time, maybe still is, was kind of divided, wildly divided, from hardcore neuroscience doing cognitive correlates of consciousness, or really specific neuronal effects to do with perception on the one hand, and at the other end, it'd be Deepak Chopra or some guy who convinced that that dark matter was the global brain or something, because it was wild. But great fun. But you're absolutely right. It's hard to take Deepak Chopra seriously.
But the interesting thing, did you get to meet him at any point, Fred?
Not really, no.
Okay.
No.
Because I think, an awful lot of people dismiss him as a snake oil salesman. I actually don't think he is, at least from what I've heard and in terms of what he's speaking. I honestly think he genuinely believes what he's saying. And like Peterson, he believes that, this is an important message to get out there.
Well, I think also like Peterson, I think he's a victim of his own success. I mean, I've watched some of Peterson's videos from a few years ago when he wasn't, the darling of the alt-right, when he was just a guy doing lectures on existentialism and so on. And it was fine. It's decent scholarship. It doesn't rock your boat, but it's all right. And but now everything he says is important, and he's talking about everything. So he's talking about Jung, and he's talking about Darwin, and he's convinced. And everyone's saying it's great, and he's getting 65 grand a month for doing it. So of course he's.
Yeah, exactly. So this comment from To Be Serious, I think, sums up all of that extremely well. One of the problems with figuring out if Jordan Peterson tells the truth, which was our debate motion, is coming to grips with what his message truly is. Plethora of content, much of it consisting of contradictory statements. I love this last sentence. He quotes that horse doctrine in a sweet coating of Christian rhetoric and Disney mythology, often sprinkled without a context quotes from Nietzsche and Jung. That's it perfectly.
You're going to love it, yeah.
Yes.
I know To Be Serious from all. She was one of the very first subscribers when I first opened my YouTube in 2007, 2008. And I've known her for years. Not personally, but just through the comment section.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you. That just encapsulates it exactly. Thanks, To Be Serious. Right, moving on swiftly. I think another 5 minutes or so, Fred. Though this is an important one. Tom Bailey he has no sympathy with Pomo at all. By Pomo, he means postmodernism. So this, again, this is another example of Peterson claiming one thing and being entirely dismissive, actually beyond that, railing against postmodernism. When I see his views, what is a core tenet of postmodernism? It's and the thing that Sakal railed against, as I said in one of the videos I did, is the idea that that everything is entirely subjective, and that, you know, every subjective opinion or every subjective viewpoint is just as valid as every other. That's exactly what Sakal railed against. Rightly or wrongly, as a scientist, I would say entirely rightly, and he's got that great quote, if you think that laws of physics are socially or culturally constructed, then I challenge you to test that particular hypothesis by stepping out the window of my 21st floor apartment, which I think is spot on. That's exactly what Sakal was railing against, and a lot of time for Sakal, because Sakal railed against postmodernism, but everything Peterson is saying espouses that postmodern view. He places his moral truths above the empirical truths. So while he might claim to have no sympathy, beyond claim, while he rails against postmodernism, he actually at the same time espouses entirely postmodernist viewpoint. I don't know what you think about that, Fred, but that's certainly how I see it.
Well, it's complex because, you know, postmodernism is complex. And there's lots of different versions of it, and there's kind of right-wing versions of it, left-wing versions of it. You name it, there's lots of different versions of it. And in some ways, yes, what he does is postmodern. You know, his kind of economic, if I can call it that, remit is straight out of Frederick Jameson's Postmodernism, the Culture of Late Capitalism. Whereas his view on and maybe his view on morals is a little bit postmodern. I'm not quite sure about that, but I don't know. It's kind of Nietzschean, and Nietzsche was a postmodernist, so, or at least one is cited as one of the early postmodernists. So yeah, there's parts of it which he is, but there's other parts in which, you know, he's, I don't know. It's a mess, really. And I think taking this broad brush saying that just because I didn't watch the video, but I know he's made a video called "Postmodern is Bad" or something like that.
Yeah, he's made a lot of those.
You know, just like, well, if you see that, you just think, oh, this person doesn't know anything about postmodernism then, because there's as many postmodernisms as, you know, the version that Leotard talks about is completely different to how it features in, I don't know, Charles Jenks's architecture, or features in, you know, bits of artwork, or it's just chaos, really. Yeah,
it is, and it's the sociology, the broader sociology of Peterson, and how he's seen as a prophet and a savior and a messiah amongst so many who would claim to be rational and skeptical, and the atheist as well. I really truly find it fascinating. It's you know, I used that Emperor's New Clothes thing a couple of times during the videos, but to me that's exactly what it is. It's this guy has railed against the use of particular pronouns for transgender studies, for transgender students. Therefore, everything else he says must have a grain of truth to it. That seems to be the thought process here. It's remarkable.
There's a lot of tribalism attached to it, unfortunately, but it's yeah. We know he speaks the truth as well, though.
I'll tell you, we've talked about the ambiguity of the arts quite a bit. Another Cassandra syndrome comment. I think that's we've covered this.
Yeah.
Trying to understand in the same way that we try to understand astronomical bodies. I think we've covered that in terms of the whole discussion about biochemistry.
One last thing, actually, before we move on, just the ambiguity of the arts. Just in relation to one of the things we came in on was talking about scholarship.
Oh yes.
There was a the day after our closing statements, there was a little Twitter feed from one of the a small publishing house that I follow that publishes in the humanities. And it was a really interesting little thread that they constructed, which is to do with this idea that producing some kind of empirical impact is the way that scholarships would work. I meant to save it, but I completely forgot. I'll see if I can find it. And the idea that solving a problem is always what it is. And scholarship is, they suggested, was really just about, can you get people to think? If you've got people to think, you've performed some kind of scholarship, which is setting the bar pretty low, but nevertheless fairly interesting, I thought.
Yeah.
and ambiguity in the arts and humanities, it almost never comes up with a result, but it might well come up with a kind of proactive sensibility, which allows different ways of looking at the world or opens things up for uncertainty and things to flow in. Absolutely. So I think ambiguity is important.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, let me go back. I've got to try and go back and right. We'll wind it up in a couple of minutes, Fred. Promise.
Yeah, let's do that.
Let's see what we got. Okay. Sorry for dashing over that, but I think we have covered this in terms of ground of our being. Okay, so this is again 2B series. Thank you for this point. The problem is we were trying to restrict ourselves to to try to narrow down the scope of what we were discussing, and I think you're right in that we didn't go into the broader sort of philosophy and mythos of Peterson. But if we were to do that, the man's got so much content, as you were saying, Fred, a couple of minutes ago. He's decided to delve into just about everything. It's very difficult to cover everything he's done. And again, when I look at dominance hierarchy and I try to understand exactly what he's saying, it's my brain just trying to find a grain of a thread of self-consistency in that is extremely difficult. And I think the best example is going back to that Harris debate time and time again, that Harris podcast, and realizing that when put on the spot and Peterson is asked to provide a consistent, self-consistent statement or position in terms of his views, he flounders all over the place. And that, that for me is incredibly indicative of the broader context of what Peterson is doing.
Yeah, I would agree completely. Again, I appreciate TB Series' comment there, but we don't have time to go into it. And some of Peterson's statements recently about gender and about, again, drawing on this kind of pseudo-Evasic dominant hierarchy stuff. He's just pulling out of an orifice, as far as I can tell. No, I wouldn't waste my time even thinking about them. They're not used.
And that's the end of the slideshow. Oh, we did it. We got there. Brilliant.
20 minutes over. That's not bad.
That's not bad at all. Good.
All right. Well, that was fantastic, Philip. Thanks so much for participating in this with this little trial with me. It was interesting, wasn't it?
It was hugely interesting. It's great to be able to recover some small corner of YouTube for slightly more intelligent and slightly more valuable, I think, debate and discussion instead of all the direct pwned nonsense that's out there. So yeah, I've hugely enjoyed it, Fred. Particularly this hangout. This hangout's been great, and as I've said, I've been made to think in a different way at times, which is always a good thing.
My work here is done.
Good. So yeah, in terms of, I don't know, your future plans, who knows?
One of I want to spend the next few days just thinking about that, reading comments again. If there's comments on this, I want to take that on board. Because YouTube doesn't provide the tools for intelligent debate. It provides tools for popularity. That's what it's for. It's a media distribution platform. So anything that exists to do something different to that has to be built on top of that platform, really. So it has to be put together by the users, it seems to me. I know there are people trying to do things like that, and that's great. So yeah, I'll be reviewing this. I've got some other ideas for debates in mind, and you and I have spoken about that, and who knows, maybe there'll be an announcement at some point quite soon about future debate, which I'm looking forward to announcing. We shall see. I won't say any more about that right now.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, certainly some of the things that I'd like to think about in the future is finding ways to get involved in the comments more, because when we first started doing this, I started replying to the comments on the video that I posted, and I thought, hang on a second, Phil hasn't got access to this. There's an imbalance here. So I stopped doing comments at all. So I've got to figure out a way whereby whoever's participating in the debate can access comments.
But I think this worked incredibly well, friend. I think that might be because that's how it would work in a traditional debate, I guess. And I guess you don't want to mirror the format exactly the same, but I think sort of trying to you know, those comments are coming in. I guess we've been selective, and apologies to those whose comments we didn't select. But I certainly don't have time. It's like I sent you that blog post a while back where I estimated over the years that I've probably done 500,000 words in terms of comments. That's just stupid. You know, particularly in the context of, you know, the undergraduates here paying $9,000 a year. They have to be the first priority. And if I wouldn't say pissing away my time, but an awful lot of it was pissing away my time debating and arguing. In terms of the comments we've had, they've been at a much higher level, and therefore it would have been more valuable. But the problem is there's only a finite amount of time in the day. So
yeah, valid point. Yeah, I completely accept that. Yeah, so I thought that was quite useful. Not sure what else we're going to be doing with debates in the future, but something like this. I mean, we'd originally, when we originally came up with the format, I had this idea that we'd be able to do rebuttals and kind of responses to one another within 24 hours. You may remember. I'd love the opening statements, 24 hours later rebuttal, 24 hours after that. But my God, of course that wouldn't be possible. It took me all my time to get them up within a week. So
yeah,
that's something
I think that I honestly think that slower pace is a much better idea, because the great thing about this is, particularly in a Hangout, what we've done here is quite structured, but often they're not structured, and often, you know, you are trying to pull out data, you're trying to think of particular papers, and you spend an awful lot of time going, well, I remember that paper back from 1997, or that paper back last year. Oh, who was the author? I can't quite remember the author. Whereas this type of format, if you've got time, it ends up with something that's so much more productive. Entertainment value of people screaming at each other, but I think it's slightly more valuable.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I thought your use of PowerPoint doing that as well made it really useful. Obviously, you can't do that in the live debate, whereas with a bit of preparation time, you can get your AV stuff sorted out, and that's really great. Makes it quicker and easier.
Exactly. Anyway, it's damn near. Oh no, it's 20 to midnight, so nearly.
That's an hour and a half. Let's knock it on the head there, Philip. What do you say?
That's great. Hugely enjoyed it, Fred. Real pleasure. See you sometime soon, I hope.
Same to you, mate. Take care now.
Okay. Bye. Bye.